Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling. This is a My Hero Academia what if fanfiction where All for One raises his son. So let's begin. The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling, Chapters 12 and 13. All for One looked down at the small thing. He wasn't sure what it was. Dr. Garaki seemed happy with it. What is this? The prototype, Kyudai replied. Hisashi frowned. I was expecting something more, he indicated. The thing was rather spindly. It possessed dark skin and had an exposed brain. There was a clear helmet covering that, and All for One could see that it had a beak-type mouth. Its legs were short, as were its upper limbs. It was naked but had no sexual organs. I thought it was best to go small. Johnny is robust and does retain control over the warp quirk. Regeneration? Hisashi asked. Kyudai shook his head. They did not have a regeneration quirk, but since healing was something which was natural, he had been hoping to stimulate something similar to regeneration by other means. Johnny has incredible life force but no regeneration. How hardy is it? Very, the doctor assured him. All for One wasn't so sure, and moved before the doctor could object, creating a blade out of one hand. He slashed it at the creature. There was resistance as his blade connected with the thing's middle. More resistance than the narrow nature of the body would suggest, but not as much as he wanted. The doctor cried out as the thing fell in two. Hisashi pulled his hand back, looking at the blade he'd created. There was no residue, but the edge wasn't as sharp as it had been. Yes, it is reasonably strong, he agreed as the doctor looked dismayed. He reformed his hand, noting the minor scratches that now covered it. They would heal. It needs to be stronger. I should not be able to cut it. For a moment it looked as if the doctor would object, then he sighed. The human body can create carbon and calcium-type armors, but against some metals, they aren't going to be enough, he said. Not without optimizing for that. He added. Hisashi took a deep breath, thinking. Quirks were so varied that it was often easy to forget they came from a human base. Those elements that comprised a body were the ones most easily worked with. Others, that the body either didn't possess, or only possessed in trace amounts, were more difficult. Rock-type quirks, for example, often relied on the surrounding earth for materials. Strengthen as much as possible then, he conceded. The next prototype should be full-sized, he added the instruction. What quirk? Pick anything, All for One waved one hand. But push two into it. Emitter types. I want the next prototype to show me its unaltered physical ability, he decided. Kyudai had picked up the brain half of the creature he called Johnny, but he nodded. You may fix that one, Hisashi said. A warp quirk, even one as inconvenient as this creature's, was useful, after all. Naomasa Tsukauchi was always a bit surprised, but thankful, at how easy it was for his friend to pass as a civilian. Put his hair down, out of those stupid raised cowlicks, and put a mask on him, and Toshinori Yagi was no longer All Might. He was glad of it. There were times when his friend needed a break from being the #1 hero. Now appeared to be one. He was sitting in the station, on the other side of his desk, and to Naomasa's eyes, he was ready to tear out his ridiculous fringe. What's up? He asked as the rest of the station moved around them. It was somewhat silly actually that the station just assumed Yagi was allowed to be sitting there, but Tsukauchi supposed that since his friend wasn't causing problems. The others had no reason to question. Have you gotten anywhere on that missing kid you told me about last year? Toshinori replied with his own question. It took him a moment to remember the case. It had pretty quickly been shelved, so quickly that Naomasa might have suspected political interference except for the fact that there were absolutely no leads. The father and son had almost literally disappeared into thin air. Knowing what he did though, that the father was Yagi's enemy, that didn't surprise him. If what Toshinori told him was true, then that man had huge resources and there was a very good possibility that he wasn't even in Japan anymore. He gave his friend a look. Yeah, okay, Yagi heaved a deep breath. It's just? Tsukauchi prompted. He's gone to ground. And I doubt it's to raise that kid. The detective blinked. You can't find him? Nope. The word was flippant, but Naomasa could tell how dejected his friend was. Not even a trace? I can find traces, Yagi admitted. That human trafficking ring? He got a nod. The plutonium scam? Another nod. You got all of that one, right? Every picogram was accounted for. Tsukauchi let out a breath he wasn't really holding. He knew his friend would have gotten everything with that one. It was called a scam to the public, but that was to cover the very real threat the scheme had posed. The rain cloud cult? Only peripherally him, Yagi replied. He doesn't do religion, he explained. And there are no leads? Nothing. Toshinori almost groaned. None that have gone anywhere. What was the partial? Naomasa immediately regretted asking the instant he saw his friend's face fall even further. Who was it? He asked breathily before Yagi could respond. He knew that look. Did you know about the hero Saberwind? He asked softly. He grimaced. Only that she'd been killed in the line of duty, the detective replied. The police department put out memos to inform officers about new heroes and of course if someone was killed or severely injured in the line of duty. It made sense. The public didn't really think much about what the police did, but they might encounter those same villains and needed warning. I don't know it was him, Yagi said, but before she was killed, there was someone who sounds very much like one of his servants asking about her. So you think? He didn't have to finish the question. The number one hero nodded. Except I can't say why. Her quirk was named Barolode, and related to air pressure. It wasn't special enough for him to want it. Not everything is quirk-related, the detective reminded his friend. It is with him, Yagi countered. Well, could there be another reason? Could she have found something accidentally? He continued with his reasoning. If she did, she didn't report it. Quantum steel made everything available for the inquiry and there was nothing there. Night Eye couldn't find anything either. Tsukauchi could tell it was bothering his friend. It would probably bother him as well if he knew more about the case. Bad timing? He asked. If you could find nothing else, then sometimes, some things happen just because of bad timing. As much as he didn't want to admit it, Saberwind could have been killed for simply being in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Maybe she saw something she wasn't meant to, and there was no premeditation behind her murder. It's possible, Yagi was forced to admit. But that doesn't explain why we think his servant was looking for her. It didn't, and Naomasa didn't like playing devil's advocate, but he felt he had to. Do you know he killed her? Could he have sent his servant out to do it? He really didn't like that word servant. Sure, as a police officer he was a public servant, but that was impersonal. The way Toshinori used the word, Tsukauchi knew his friend was talking about a far more personal servitude, and he did not want to know the type of man who took pleasure in that nowadays. Probably. And from all accounts, this servant isn't too intelligent. So the servant was sent to kill her, for some reason. But to find her, he had to ask where she was. Naomasa summarized what his friend had no doubt already heard before. That sounds about right, Yagi sighed again. What have you told the woman? What woman? Naomasa was confused. The woman with the missing kid. It was Tsukauchi's turn to sigh. Not much. What can we tell her? He asked rhetorically. Ma'am, your husband is a world-renowned, immortal criminal with more resources than we know about. The only reason we can see for him to be attracted to you is your quirk, and we think he took your son because he inherited some sort of amalgamation of both your quirks. He made the statement blandly. Yagi had the good taste to grimace. That was about the truth, and it would not help the poor woman. She said her son was quirkless. And she believes that, but before the case went nowhere, I did some research into the doctor who made the diagnosis. The number one hero perked up. Nothing definite, Tsukauchi told him. If he had something to find, he would have already given it to his friend. The doctor was registered as a Dr. Tsubasa, and has all the relevant qualifications and all that, but he closed up shop about 3 weeks after the kid disappeared. And you didn't speak to him? He could feel the frustration in his friend's question. We weren't looking at the quirk angle then, Naomasa admitted, which told Toshinori everything he needed to know. They hadn't questioned the doctor. As sickening as it is, I have an easier time believing the kid has a quirk than doesn't have one. I just don't know why he didn't take it, or replace it and leave by himself. You and me both, Tsukauchi confirmed. The case wasn't particularly special. There was no violence with it, no foul play beyond the disappearance, but it haunted him. As one of the first cases he got when he became a detective, it was one of his first failures, and no matter how the brass told him they hadn't expected anything else, not once the initial search had revealed nothing, he wanted to do better. Naomasa looked at his friend. Something will show up. He will make a mistake, he predicted. No matter how powerful this man was, and he knew that the criminal all for one was very powerful. He'd make a mistake somewhere. They just had to find it. He will, Yagi agreed with a snort. And he's an arrogant enough son of a bitch that he won't even believe he's made a mistake. In the meantime then, come and get some food with me, Tsukauchi said as he rose and picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. You can't catch villains on an empty stomach, he joked. Toshinori sighed but nodded as he stood. Naomasa could tell his friend was frustrated, but he had nothing to offer him except support and friendship. He hoped that was enough. Izuku frowned at his notebook. It was the notebook he kept for himself and his quirk. Today they had learned about atoms in class. Miss Kushi had explained that they were the smallest form of matter, made up of electrons, protons and neutrons. She'd explained that everything was made of atoms, even air. When she'd said that, Izuku had immediately wondered if the air atoms were what his quirk, Kali Imperium, interacted with. But his classroom teacher didn't say much. So he was left to speculate. Theoretically, Kali Imperium had to interact with something. Dad wouldn't have named it that if it didn't, but Miss Kushi had said that there were lots of different types of atoms and Izuku had no idea what made up air. Still, if air was made up of atoms, and Kali Imperium interacted with those atoms, then there were some more applications he could think about. He already knew he could move things with it. The first time he'd used the quirk, he'd made the bit of paper Dad had held up move. And then he'd cut it. So, if he cut it and if he moved it, there was something solid his quirk was impacting. And if it was solid, what else could he do with it? He already knew he could control Kali Imperium to cut paper, which meant he must be forcing his control down to a tight, narrow band, but could he expand it? Could he make something solid that could lift things, instead of just move them? Could he lift himself? Could he use Kali Imperium with fire breath to direct where the fire went? If he could, that would increase his range enormously. He was limited to how far he could project his breath, which was more than his friends, but not really far enough to be useful. There were so many possibilities and he couldn't help but hum to himself as he stopped frowning and started to write ideas in his notebook. He couldn't wait until he saw Dad again for a practice session. Dad didn't mind if he thought of ideas to try. In fact, he encouraged Izuku to think of things to do with his quirk. But he did mind if Izuku practiced by himself. He always had to be present, or Kurogiri did, and Izuku knew that both were really busy, so he couldn't practice as often as he'd like. Even when he promised he'd keep it small and be careful, the answer was either a straight-out no, or, when you are older. He was almost 6. How old was older? He felt something move behind him and without thinking Izuku thrust out with Kali Imperium. There was an oof, and he turned in the chair to see Tomura picking himself off the floor. I'm sorry. TCH, the older boy muttered. Sorry. Izuku repeated. I didn't mean to get you so hard. Dad gave me a new quirk, he added the explanation because he knew Tomura would demand one. The gray-haired boy rolled his eyes. Well, at least you are leveling up, he told Izuku. But I didn't sense you until you were really close. Izuku told him. He hadn't sensed Tomura enter the room. Of course not. You had your nose in that book, the other boy growled. I was writing ideas for the quirk. He explained. What does it do? It controls air, Izuku said brightly. Tomura's gold eyes flashed and Izuku could tell he was interested despite not wanting to be. He came to sit at the table with Izuku. So what else can you do with it beyond hitting me? I was thinking that if I can hit things, then I might be able to lift things. And I might be able to lift me. BAH. Boring. Tomura dismissed Izuku's suggestion. If you create a force, then you can create a force on someone and hold them in place. You could press down on their chest, or better yet, if it's air control, you could make sure that they can't get any air. Far more useful. Izuku looked at the older boy. He had a hand resting on each of his upper arms, and 2 around his neck. Another 2 were around his chest. That's not very nice, Izuku objected. Tomura glared at him. Fucking hero, he hissed, slamming his hands down on the table. No. Izuku yelled. Tomura didn't have gloves on. One hand hit the table and his notebook. And the other hit his notebook. All 5 fingers. Izuku grabbed at it, trying to rip away the affected pages before they got to the others, but it was too late. Ha! Serves you right. Tomura laughed as he left the room. Izuku looked dismayed at the small pile of dust that had been his notebook, and then at the scraps of paper he'd managed to pull out. At least he'd saved some random notes, but the book was gone. He already knew there was no point in complaining to Kurogiri. There wasn't anything that could be done to retrieve his notebook, and so with a sigh he got up and moved to the kitchen, looking through the cupboards for a dustpan and brush. Once he cleaned up, he could start a new notebook. At least this one had been about him, and he could easily duplicate what was in it, but he'd have to figure out a way of keeping the books safe in future. As he cleaned, Izuku frowned as he thought. Tomura may have actually helped in that respect. If he could create a steady pressure, then he could pick things up, and he could hold someone against a wall or something like that. But maybe he could create a barrier over his notebook. Then Tomura could slam his hands down all he wanted, but he wouldn't make contact. He'd make contact with the air atoms, and Izuku didn't care about them. He hurried to clean up the dust. He had to get a new notebook started now. Make a wish, Okeiko yelled. Ha! Izuku looked up. He'd been about to blow out the candles on his birthday cake. It's tradition, she told him. Oh, all right, Izuku replied. This was the first birthday party he could remember with friends. Last year, his dad had spent the day with him and he'd had a small party with Tomura and Kurogiri, but they weren't exactly friends. The year before, when he was 4, he couldn't remember. Maybe there had been friends there? And he definitely couldn't remember the birthdays before that. So this one, his 6th birthday, was special. His friends, and their parents were here. They weren't at the bar. Kurogiri had decided that the bar would not be suitable for his birthday. They were instead in one of the large presentation rooms at his dad's office. It was the weekend, so the company wasn't using it. It had a brilliant view of the city as well, and several of the parents had lined up at the window just looking at it. Dad hadn't wanted a big party, and so Izuku had only been able to invite his closest friends. Okeiko, Minato and Kazu. That was enough, and they were having fun. The other kids at school didn't really like him, and occasionally, Arata or Gatarui called him a sympathizer, but they never went any further. The disapproving stares of the teachers saw to that. I wish foe. Little dragon, you aren't meant to tell us. Oh, Izuku blinked. Okay, he chirped, wondering about the reason for a moment before he took another deep breath and blew out the candles, making his wish silently. He was careful not to use fire breath. He didn't think Kurogiri would appreciate that 2 years running. When the last candle gutted out, there was a cheer and everyone clapped. Izuku grinned. It was so nice to be with friends, and being in his dad's office building meant that Gigantamakia could be with them as well. Izuku didn't see the huge man very often, but he was always nice. And sometimes Dad let him play, a little anyway. Gigantamakia was always willing to play hide and seek and was way faster than he appeared. Kurogiri came over when the candles were out and carefully pulled them out. He pulled a knife from somewhere and began cutting it into slices. What did you wish for? Minato asked Izuku. Hey, he's not meant to tell, Okeiko reminded them all before Izuku could tell the other boy. Minato's skin was dark purple today. He said that even though he could make his skin green, green was Izuku's color, so instead, he'd picked a color that complemented green. Izuku thought he just liked purple. I wished for something good, Izuku gave the hint, but was quickly distracted when Kurogiri announced that the cake was ready. The 4 children rushed over to him and the warp gate carefully divided up the slices between them. Izuku could see that the yellow-eyed man had cut more for the parents, and he quickly counted. There was a slice for each of his friends' parents, once for Gigantamakia, one for Kurogiri himself, one for Tomura and one for his dad. That left 1 slice over. Who was that for? It's for you, Izuku, Kurogiri saw him counting. After birthday cake, he explained. Izuku wasn't sure what that was, but it sounded good. Thanks, Kurogiri, he said before tucking into his cake now. Around him his friends did the same. Life was good. Who did you say Izuku's father was again? Tamiko Uraraka said. Controlled enough not to choke on her drink, but it was a close thing. Chinatsu Amano laughed gently. I'm surprised myself, she admitted. When Minato told me little Izuku's party was to be held here, I thought Izuku was the son of one of the executives, not the owner. Yes, Kazu always told me that Izuku's father worked for, but she never mentioned where. Hiroki Nakashima nodded. But his name is Chui, not Riji, Tamiko objected, reminding them of Izuku's surname. That's for his protection, the smooth voice of Hisashi Riji interjected as the man himself walked up to them. He was dressed casually, still in a suit, but his collar was unbuttoned and his white hair was artfully ruffled. Chinatsu nodded her understanding. Of all of them, she understood the most about needing protection. As a lawyer, she'd worked on some very controversial cases where the witnesses and sometimes the accused were under protection. Tamiko still looked confused. She and her husband, Sozanushi, ran a small construction company. She'd heard of. They were a huge company with a branch that was construction-based, but they weren't competitors. Ran multi-billion yen jobs. Their company was lucky to clear 10 million yen jobs. There have been several unfortunate incidents, Hisashi said delicately. Hiroki leaned over to Tamiko and whispered the further explanation. She went pale and her eyes widened. Almost comically. That's terrible. She gasped. Thus, for my little dragon's protection, he uses the name Chui, Hisashi pronounced. I trust this won't be a problem? The adults understood the question. Of course not, Chinatsu spoke for them all. Their children had a lot more to gain from knowing Izuku Rigi than the other way around. She would speak to Minato so that he didn't jeopardize anything. Good, I have enough lawyers on retainer, Hisashi joked. Chinatsu had the good taste to chuckle. Thank you for coming, Hisashi continued. It's our pleasure, Hiroki responded. I understand why it's such an intimate affair now, he added a touch nervously. Hisashi nodded. Izuku hasn't made as many friends as I might have hoped. I'm afraid some of his opinions have alienated others, but he is dedicated to your children, so I do thank you. Alienated others? Tamiko asked. How did a 6-year-old alienate others? Izuku spends time with my lead researchers, Hisashi explained. They are very fond of facts and statistics. And some of them are not that acceptable to the general public. That explains why he's so good at science and maths, Chinatsu murmured. I'm glad he's helping Minato. Their children might be very young yet, but Izuku was well versed in those fields. Tamiko chuckled. Okeiko did tell me Izuku had lots of questions when they learned about atoms, she commented. How are facts not acceptable? Kazu's father asked. He was a salaryman, and while that wasn't a glamorous job, he dealt with facts and figures all the time. 2 + 2 always equaled 4 in his world. There was no other interpretation. Society is sometimes difficult, Hisashi replied with a shrug, but he could see that the group wanted a further explanation. Inwardly he sighed. This would be a test of friendship because he could easily see these parents telling their children to remain away from Izuku if they didn't like his facts. So be it. If it happened, it would serve a greater purpose for Izuku to see what the world was truly like. With all due respect, facts are facts, Hiroki said. Chinatsu looked mildly amused. As a lawyer, she was well aware of how interpretation was often central to facts. Hisashi sighed theatrically. I believe it came down to some questions Izuku asked about quirkless children. That was not a statement they were expecting. He could see the signs of shock on all their faces. All for one plowed on. 1 in 5 children born today is quirkless, he explained. Surely not? Hiroki objected. There are no quirkless children in Kazu's class, he pointed out. They are in their own classes, Hisashi told them. He could tell from the way they reacted, they had no idea this was the case. He'd discovered everything there was to know about it when he'd called the school after Izuku's first day. They'd also provided him with the name of a middle school that had the same policies. Dr. Garaki had already made some tentative offers to some of the younger teens, and while none had been needed yet, they had names now. Education was compulsory until the completion of middle school. After that, All for One imagined many of those quirkless students would have trouble finding a high school that would accept them, let alone a university. That's not Tamiko started but was interrupted as Hiroki nodded forcefully. Good, Kazu's father said. That's as it should be, he added. Hisashi wasn't surprised at his vehemence despite Hiroki's previous insistence that facts were facts. He'd seen as time went on that those with weak quirks often wanted to emphasize the differences to reassure themselves of their supposed superiority. He had seen it at the dawn of quirks, in reverse though. There were those, non-quirked, individuals who wholeheartedly welcomed those with quirks. They saw nothing wrong with it, but the majority, the uneducated, the prejudiced were those who were scared. Those who wanted to destroy the quirked. He almost wished they could see the world now. I think the more interesting question is why people without quirks are still being born, Hisashi said delicately. Chinatsu was wise enough to know he would have said something else and Tamiko nodded her agreement. She wasn't understanding the subtleties of the conversation, but Hisashi could tell she was an honest woman. He'd seen her company's books. She didn't have time for prejudice, or anything that didn't help bring in the yen. They shouldn't be, Hiroki stated. Inwardly, all for one nodded but not in agreement. This man was one of those people for whom facts were facts, until they interfered with his beliefs. They are, which is a very interesting scientific question, but not one for my little dragon's birthday. He concluded, turning back to the children. Izuku had led them to Gigantomachia and somehow had convinced the huge man to let them climb over him. Gigantomachia had an odd smile on his features but was holding steady as he was swarmed by the 6-year-olds. Tomura was looking bored as he stood off to the side. He was next to Kurogiri and Hisashi could tell he was uncomfortable without the hands that usually graced his body. It would have been too difficult to explain them, so he had been forced to leave them at the bar. This was for his benefit. Hisashi had reminded him that every now and then, even for player characters, it was necessary to be disguised. This was practice. Izuku laughed as he walked along one of Gigantomachia's outstretched arms. He was the picture of childhood innocence and Hisashi felt his heart warm as he looked at his son. Life was good. End chapters 12 and 13, The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.